So pesticides. They can be unhealthy, irritating, and flat-out toxic, and are yet altogether necessary. Without pesticides, food production in the U.S. would struggle and prices would soar, tick-borne diseases would be out of control, and farmers would have to cultivate fields much more to prevent weeds, which would lead to soil erosion and changes in the water cycle. A major downside to pesticides is that once a solution has been applied, there are only a number of places it can go. It can go to the atmosphere by volatilization, it can be broken down by photolysis, or most likely it can be incorporated into surface water by runoff or groundwater through leakage into aquifers. And unfortunately, older and cheaper pesticides can remain in the water cycle for years, mainly in slow-moving sections like groundwater. Incorporation of pesticides into the water cycle is pretty inevitable, especially considering that drainage on farms is so good to prevent flooding. However, there are a variety of factors that determine the risk of severe water pollution, like the active ingredient, the half-life, contaminations or impurities, additives like solvents, and degradates formed during chemical or microbial reactions. So it's hard to tell the effects a pesticide will have before it's used. This factor of unpredictability is just why the U.S. strayed away from the use of pesticides in the 1960s and instead tried to focus their efforts onto integrated pest management systems, or IPMs. But that didn't last long. Now the U.S. is relatively lenient with pesticide use, especially compared to other places like the EU, which has some of the strictest pesticide laws in the world. In the U.S., it took a while for people to figure out that IPMs on their own were not sufficient and that some of these pesticides were really needed in some form, especially insecticides. And although they are arguably one of the most useful types of pesticides, insecticides are more toxic to humans than herbicides. They are known to cause skin and eye irritation, harm to the nervous system, issues with hormone or endocrine regulation, and even cancer. Now let's look at an example of an insecticide that attracted a lot of attention in the US during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. DDT stands for
Dichlorodiphenyltrichloroethane.
Yeah, what he said, which was the first modern synthetic insecticide that was primarily used for agriculture, as well as reducing the transmission of insect-borne diseases. DDT was initially really effective at killing mosquitoes, which are the main spreaders of malaria. But what ended up happening is that many insects developed a resistance to DDT, so it became decreasingly effective in the late 60s. While all of this was good, people started to discover some negative effects of DDT in humans and wildlife. When it gets into the human body, some DDT breaks down into DDE, which stays in the body for longer periods of time than DDT. Both of these chemicals are stored in fatty tissues and can be passed down to fetuses. What studies showed was that high levels of DDT exposure in humans could lead to disruptions of the nervous system, causing vomiting, dizziness, seizures, etc., and the development of tumors, giving it the title of a possible carcinogen. It also caused similar effects in wildlife, particularly affecting reproductive systems of some animals. So, despite the benefits of DDT as an insecticide, the Environmental Protection Agency banned the use of DDT in 1972 due to its negative health effects and decreasing effectiveness. Now, this made a lot of sense in a country with no malaria, but in other countries, especially in Africa, DDT was still being used predominantly to reduce the spread of malaria. In a UN Environmental Program Treaty in 1996, the Stockholm Convention, the UN placed restrictions on a group of chemicals that included DDT, so that reduced the use of it in more countries. However, the World Health Organization in 2006 announced that African countries could still use DDT indoors to try to help kill mosquitoes and stop the spread of malaria. While this may seem distant to the US, DDT can actually travel long distances in the upper atmosphere, and it remains in the body after people stop using it, so its effects can be longer lasting than the regulations put in place. Okay, the good news is that in 2003 and 2004, the CDC repeated a study that they had done in the 1970s, and they found that DDT and DDE levels in the blood of a sample of the population was 5 to 10 times lower than the values in the 1970s. This shows that the banning of DDT was helpful in reducing the negative effects of the chemical. Yay!